One more round of applause for Rick. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Leonie Diaz. I am a recent graduate from Florida International University with a bachelor's in international relations. I am also a two-time Intelligence Community Center for Academic Excellence Fellow, one time on the Intelligence Analysis track and another time on the Cyber Threat Intelligence track. Over the past couple months, I've had the pleasure to conduct an open source research project on Cuba, its relationship with transnational criminal organizations in Venezuela. And it is my honor to introduce this panel, the Venezuela and Cuba panel. And it is even more so my honor to introduce our distinguished moderator, Dr. Nora Gámez Torres, who is a distinguished journalist for Nuevo Herald and the Miami Herald. And she has trailblazing research on Cuba and Latin American policy. Please welcome me and the moderator in a round of applause to join this panel in applause.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel, Venezuela and Cuba, Future Scenarios, Risks, and Strategic Opportunities. I cannot think of a better moment to have this discussion. So I'm grateful to FIU, to the Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and especially to Brian Fonseca, its director, for the opportunity to moderate this important conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce this distinguished panel. Ambassador Story served as both ambassador and charge d'affaires to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela from July 2018 until May 2023. In June 2024, he was nominated as ambassador to Mozambique. He has taught at Georgetown University, served as the charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy to Angola and Sao Tome and Principe, as well as the charge d'affaires in Eswatini, and to the Dutch Caribbean from Curaçao. They kept you busy.
Yeah, a little bit.
Ambassador Story retired on May 2025. Rosa María Payá is a fellow in Latin American Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and she's a commissioner at the Inter-American Commissioner for Human Rights. Rosa, as you know, everyone that knows her knows, she's a fierce advocate for human rights and democracy in Cuba, following the legacy of her father, Osvaldo Payá. She's the founder of Cuba Decide and president of the Latin American Youth Network for Democracy. And she's the latest recipient of Freedom House Alfred Moses Liberty Award, so congratulations, Rosa, felicidades. Elisabeth Maigler is the project director for Central America at the Friedrich Foundation for Freedom, and she has a degree in political science and modern history from the University of Bonn and Potsdam in Germany. And she has been working on the foundation for 20 years, I think, since 2006, where she has been coordinator of the Mexico project, regional assistant for Latin America, as well as coordinator of the programs for Central America and climate change. So thank you all for being here. So I think we can all agree how much US policy towards the Western Hemisphere has changed in a matter of months. We might see significant changes happening in Cuba. And we have already been seeing major changes in Venezuela, which impacts that extend beyond, its borders and cross into, migration and regional security and geopolitical dynamics. And yet, regimes in Havana and Caracas, they're doing everything possible to adapt and survive. Even, despite, unprecedented pressure, economic, political, even military pressure. So how should we think about the most plausible, future scenarios in both countries, and where do you see the greatest risks and opportunities in the coming years? So I'm going to pass the magic ball to all of you. So who wants to start? Ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you to FIU, to President Nunez for this opportunity, and thank you for that introduction. I should say that I'm here in my personal capacity and not representing the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And when we talk about Cuba and Venezuela, I think that one important element that we should keep in mind is that we are not talking about parallel cases. We are, in many sense, talking about the same case. We wouldn't be talking about the liberation of Venezuela if not for the actions of the Cuban regime for the last 25 years. It was obvious for everybody when the largest amount of people that died during the extraction of Nicolás Maduro were Cuban soldiers. And the Cuban regime has been a defining element, propping up Hugo Chavez, helping him to get to power, and then organizing the whole military counterintelligence and the whole structure of the state to be able to command and control and also support the maintenance of the dictatorship in that country. Now, having said so, they are also on the field very different cases. The way in which power is exerted in Venezuela is different from the way in which power is exerted in Cuba. And in that regard, I think that we need to be very conscious of the historical moment that the Cuban people are living right now. We have to be very conscious of the convergence of the elements that for first time in decades we are seeing in Cuba. The Cuban people are enduring a humanitarian catastrophe that is provoked and generated by the Cuban regime. The Cuban people have been living through a humanitarian crisis for decades. Right now, the situation is unsustainable. It's gonna come the moment in which, even when the thermoelectrics try to work and have the oil, the country is gonna stay in a blackout, because the reality is that the regime has no capacity to provide basic service in Cuba, and the energetic system and virtually every system in Cuba is collapsing, but the repressive structure. That one is alive and kicking. As we speak, there are more than 1,200 political prisoners in Cuba, and the only reason why that regime is still in place is because of the use of the force against their own citizens. But we talk about the convergence of several elements, right? The first one of them, the most important one of them, is the civic mobilization inside Cuba, and the Cuban people demand for freedom is very obvious and eloquent. Not only from 2021, when we saw the whole country in the streets demanding freedom, but 2025 ended up with an average of 30 protests a day, even when the hunger is at its maximum, when there are not medicines in the pharmacy or at the hospitals, where people cannot know if they are going to feed their children at the end of the day, even when lights are not on. For the Cuban people, there is a conviction that the only way out, the only way to overcome the crisis, is to get rid of the dictatorship. At the same time, the democratic alternative for the Cuban people exists, and the main democratic forces of the opposition are united behind the Freedom Accord and a transition plan to be ready in the moment that the totalitarian power fractures, as it will fracture. And the third point, the third element that is in existence right now and that is new for the Cuban people is that international pressure, specifically the pressure coming from the US government, that is mounting over those that are in the position of taking the decision of keep shooting down and throwing in jail the teenagers in the streets, or submitting to the will of the people and leave. That convergence now exists, and I think that will be intensifying during the next months, Nora.
Thank you, Rosa. Elisabeth?
Thank you to FIU for having me. Well, I think we are living in a very crucial moment in history. We have seen changes in Venezuela, and we will hopefully see them soon in Cuba. And of course, when we are looking at Venezuela, economic recovery is important, but it is not a sole step. We have to think also of democratization, and we have to think of democratization processes very soon. The window of opportunity we see here is very small from my point of view. So we have in parallel to think about how to strengthen institutions, and we have to push forward the first steps, thinking of liberation of political prisoners, thinking of transitional justice, because the moment we are seeing is very important, and we have to speed it up from my point of view, because speeding up in Venezuela might also mean more imminent actions regarding Cuba.
Ambassador, what's in the future for these two countries?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have been conditioned by watching the failures of lots of careers in the State Department on the Cuba question. So I'm not going to talk about Cuba. I'm going to talk about Venezuela. And I'm also cognizant that I'm here in South Florida. So we'll talk Venezuela. I want to start by saying that no one outside of Venezuela, perhaps also Weston and Doral, is more excited about seeing Nicolas Maduro in jail than I am. January 3rd was an extraordinary tactical success. My concern now is that I see in a very acute case, in the case of Venezuela, what I am seeing across the hemisphere, which is democratic backsliding and institutional weakening. When I looked, and we talked about that this morning, as we consider that the new national security strategy has a focus on the Western Hemisphere, I think that's fantastic. I think it should. Everything that happens in Latin America has a direct impact on the United States of America in a way that other regions really don't. But we have to start working on our own institutions so that we're not working by executive order, but we're having some actual legal some laws passed, some bipartisanship as well. And I think about the Plan Colombia. And I recently articulated this in an article we published with the Atlantic Council, that what the region needs is a Plan Venezuela next. We have to actually take this idea of a focus in our hemisphere and broaden it and put action and resources behind the idea of a strategic focus. We've spent $45 billion in the last couple of weeks in Iran. We don't really blink an eye at that, yet we spent 20 years and $10 billion to save the institutions in Colombia and create a regional partner that's the cornerstone of our relationship in the hemisphere. We need to be doing the same thing across the hemisphere. We need to build stronger institutions. And in the case of Venezuela, who knew, for instance, that Vladimir Pugino Lopez was secretly a clandestine cultivator of corn or soybeans or whatever else? He's now the Minister of Agriculture. What does that tell you about what's actually happening on the ground in Venezuela? And ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you that this exact same regime under new management, and we need to start making the hard asks now. And part of these hard asks is about how do we rebuild institutions in a country that for 25 years made a decision to undermine those institutions and put them at the specific task of making sure that one political movement stayed in power. When I saw Secretary Burgum, I'm repeating some of what I said this morning, but y'all weren't there, so it's new to you. When I saw Secretary Burgum take the Interior to go down with a bunch of mining companies, I thought to myself, well, that's great. Who's going to get rid of the ELN? Because it's not the FAN-B, it's not the Bolivarian National Guard, and it's certainly not the police in Venezuela. So we have to work, if we're going to have this economic recovery, it's going to have to go in lockstep with the democratization and reinstitutionalization of the country. What I think we should be working on now, we've hit the 4-month plus mark, is okay, what are the things that we should be asking of the regime in Venezuela to start making the shift? That sends a signal to the international business community that it's safe to invest in that country. Because again, capital is a coward. Capital is not going to go where it's put at risk. I don't believe ConocoPhillips is going to say, okay, let's invest another $10 billion after they've already been robbed of $9 billion by the same people who are in power. And I don't believe it's possible to start working in the Arco Minero in Venezuela if you have ELN actively mining in that area and killing members of the the national forces, the army of Venezuela. So we need to start asking the hard things. Hard things don't get easier with time, right? Easy things we haven't asked for. CNN en Español, it's not on the air. I did 3 interviews yesterday in Spanish. All 3 of those websites are blocked from being able to transmit into Venezuela. That's an easy ask, and we haven't done that. So I think we can really turn the page on Venezuela by starting to ask the hard things now.
Let me follow on that because I have a question about that. So, Ambassador, Professor Javier Corrales, a political scientist, he penned a provocative piece recently on Foreign Affairs. And he said that following the U.S. capture of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, the U.S., and I quote, removed the dictator but kept the dictatorship, end of quote. I watched this recent congressional hearing in which senior State Department official Michael Cosa, which I'm sure you know very well, defended the administration's choice to prioritize stability by working with Delcy Rodriguez, and stated that the U.S. is, and I quote, now helping Venezuela transition from a criminal enabler to a responsible partner through the 3-phase approach to Venezuela stabilization and democratic transition. So the question is, should we give the administration more time to see if this policy is working towards a democratic transition? And this is an argument I always hear from policymakers, oh, you know, it didn't work because they didn't give it enough time to work. Or is Corrales and some members of the Venezuelan opposition correct in fearing that the administration might forget to advance those a meaningful political transition in Venezuela, those democratic goals? And we see Delcy Rodriguez moving to consolidate her presidency. So what signs would indicate that Venezuela is actually moving to a transition, a political transition? How do we get there?
Look, you have to do phase 2 and phase 3 together. I mean, that's full stop. And I don't disagree with, and I actually said this before January 3rd. I said, I knew we were going to do something. I didn't anticipate, actually I had 4 ideas. This was number 4, what we actually did. So don't listen to me. I obviously don't know what I'm talking about. I thought it was the least likely outcome. But I said, be careful of de-Baathification. But one thing is not de-Baathifying. The other is removing Saddam Hussein and putting Uday and Hussein in charge, right? The sons, if y'all remember. And what we've done is we kept that stability piece, but at some point, María Corina Machado is going to go back. I mean, politics is a contact sport, and she'll go back. I think she'll go back in the next couple of months. I think she should go back. Are we going to tell her, don't go back because it could be destabilizing? And what I would submit is I think we're going to, yes, of course, I'm going to give the administration time on this. I think you have to give people time on these things. But I'd like to see some signals that we're starting to also work on phase 3 while we're convincing people that phase 2 is full steam ahead.
Which signs would that be? Like, what do you want to see?
How about something super easy? No more internet blocks on information, and allow CNN en Español, Fox en Español, si lo tienen, no sé, can go into Venezuela without a block. I mean, that I think is a minimum thing. I'd love to see Diosdado Cabello off the scene. And I'd love to see, or I would prefer to see USG officials not taking photographs with a person who has $25 million reward for justice on his head. But having said that, is it going to be easier to get rid of Diosdado Cabello in 3 months or 6 months? And the answer is no. It's going to be more difficult in the future. And I think that maybe that's one we can't do right now, but there's plenty of easy stuff we can do. Return the political parties to their rightful leaders. What about that one? I mean, there are plenty of things that we've worked on in the past. There's a long list of them. I just haven't seen them move in this direction yet.
I've been covering U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America for a while, and it's always struck me like how specifically policies towards Cuba and Venezuela swing back and forth in a matter of a few years, from engagement to sanctions to back. So from your experience, Ambassador, what do you see the gap between policy planning and policy outcomes, and what have U.S. policymakers have gotten wrong or overlooked that is worth highlighting at this particular moment so we don't do the same mistakes?
I've worked for 5 presidents and 9 secretaries of state, and I've not agreed with all of them all the time. I think that's a healthy part of being part of democracy. Right. I think that under the first Trump administration, we believed that pressure alone was going to yield a break in the system, and that we were going to have this fissure inside of the regime that would then lead to a good result. Under the Biden administration, a lot of people complained about the fact that the Biden administration wanted to do a negotiation, but it actually led to a primary result that María Corina won. And then it led to a very little known person named Edmundo Gonzalez winning the presidency in July of 2024. But we gave up a lot of leverage in the process of doing that, perhaps too much leverage in that direction. For me, January 3rd was kind of bittersweet, because I think at some level it showed a failure of diplomacy to get to the end result. That we had to go to that Clausewitz, wars, diplomacy by other means type thing. And I think that both administrations made plenty of mistakes. I think that the action taken was perhaps necessary in a lot of regards. We were running out of options. That happened on January 3rd. And again, I applaud the result. Now I'd like to make sure that we get a solid, independent, democratic nation state in Venezuela, and not one that continues to harbor ELN and FARC-D, continues to work with our strategic competitors, and that continues to abuse the human rights of the people within its borders. I mean, for me, 8.5 million people voted with their feet, and it's an extraordinary catastrophe for the region. So we can Monday morning quarterback all the time. I mean, it's easy to say, we should have done this, should have done that. But right now where we are, let's be clear-eyed about who's still in charge, and how do we use the leverage we have? Because tomorrow we're going to have less leverage, and the next day we're going to have a little bit less leverage. Our leverage was at its maximum on January the 4th. So we got to use the leverage now to get where we want to be. And I'm curious about the future of Cuba. I'm trying to get off the stage right now, right? So do we have the leverage there? What is that going to look like? Sorry, I'm not supposed to be asking the questions, but.
No, that's a good question, and we can follow up with Rosa. Elisabeth, it is clear that for a democratic transition to happen in Venezuela, there must be, reconstruction of public trust in institutions. How do we do that in the current political environment in which, Delcy Rodriguez and the others are very much in charge?
Yeah, in fact, citizens have to see soon results of this process, starting with the release of political prisoners, so that citizens understand that rights are respected and restored. So an amnesty law has to be applied equally and correctly. Mm-hmm. And when we speak about transitional justice, it's not only for the victims, but also for the perpetrators in the end. You have to, I think we have to recognize that as a reality. Mm-hmm. And then we need a real independence in the judiciary. Mm-hmm. Because without that, there will be no possibility for investors, for example, to deal with challenges in the country when there is no legal system they can rely on, no legal certainty. And then, of course, the next step, a very important step, because people have to understand that they might change power structures through elections. So free, fair, and competitive elections, prior dialogue between, yes, the authorities and the opposition groups have to be in place soon. I mean, I know that the election process is part of the US strategy, but there is no concrete date mm-hmm. that citizens might rely on. And this is kind of the first group of immediate processes that have to start. And then, of course, in the second phase, where people might rebuild trust in institutions, can refer to a professionalization of the security forces, that people really see that members of this authoritarian regime are stepping back, or that there are consequences for their actions perpetrated during the regime. And then, of course, you will strengthen a dialogue between politics, between civil society, and you will initiate programs of capacity building for organizations of the civil society. And there, I think development aid enters with institutions that might support those processes and give them legitimacy. And in parallel, of course, the stabilization of the economy and the reduction of inequality will do the last part of this rebuilding the trust from citizens towards institutions and towards a democratic process that restores their rights and let them regain also economic possibilities to develop businesses and to participate in decision-making process.
I think the question of leverage is so important here because we're basically asking an authoritarian regime to cooperate into its own dismantling, which to me it's, you know, like extraordinary. But I want to continue with you, Elisabeth, because the administration has framed its Cuba and Venezuela policy as part of a broader doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, this Dome Road doctrine that is putting U.S. dominance in a center and is preoccupied with managing migration and countering adversaries. How do you see you know, events in Cuba and Venezuela and U.S. policy towards those countries shaping some of these regional dynamics? I'm thinking, for example, well, Venezuela and Cuba are under a travel ban, for example. So that has, I guess, you know, important impacts on migration in the region as well. And even Maduro's capture, for example, highlighted the perils of relying on Chinese and Russian technology. So how do you see this happening?
Well, as long as we see relief of sanctions, which might mean an economic development in the near future, migration might decrease. If you tighten sanctions, or if you think of programs of the temporary protected status, then you will see a shift in migration flows, not towards the United States, of course, but to other countries in the region. So in the way you relieve sanctions, you might also see a returning of migrants, of Venezuelans, to their country. So it is also a return of talent to the country, talent that might contribute to the development and the processes ahead. But it will depend on how migrants feel the economic pressure. If they see a possibility to stay in Venezuela, I'm sure that nobody wants to live in exile.
Right.
You know, exile is a very difficult scenario for everybody. So getting back to Venezuela is surely a possibility for those migrants, for those 8-9 millions that left their country, but they have to have certain guarantees that they will be able to survive and generate wealth and in their own country. That's for the migration issue. For the shifting of powers and power blocks in the
alliances,
region, we will see Venezuela getting pulled more towards the US and the Western Hemispheric to bind them within this system. And we will see, for the moment, Cuba being pushed towards the other powers, namely China, Iran, Russia, in a way that is worrying, because the Cuban government regime relies on those powers, on that support for the moment. And it is interesting how Latin American countries will position in that sense, because the influence of China, of Russia, is very important and very worrisome in the region. So to push that influence back is starting with this process.
Let me continue with Cuba, Rosa. In that congressional hearing I was mentioning, Ambassador Kozak was asked, and I quote, "Is the model for the discussions in Cuba the same as what has occurred in Venezuela?" And after stating that the two countries were very different, he went on to say, and I quote, "If you can get some people in those regimes to start making real changes in the direction that we want, that's a good model," end of quote. Is that a good model for a transition in Cuba? And if not, what are the alternatives given the fact that the Cuban government seems to be still in control and able to suppress dissent?
There is no need or desire for a Delcy Rodriguez in Cuba. I want to be crystal clear with that. It's not a path towards any positive outcome. It is unrealistic and naive to believe that the Castro family is gonna commit suicide voluntarily. They're not. Now, to your point, Ambassador, the leverage that the US government now has, the size of the upper hand, I believe that in combination with the demand for freedom and the civic mobilization coming from the Cuban people and the democratic alternative ready to act the moment the power fractures is the right combination to finally eliminate what has been the head of the authoritarian octopus in our region for decades. You were mentioning the ELN, El Ejército de Liberación Nacional, operating right now at the border, in Venezuelan territory and in Colombian territory. The ELN was founded by Fidel Castro and have been co-directed by the Cuban intelligence for decades till today. We are in a security conference. We cannot just forget that a definitive element in the impossibility that our region has had for decades of achieving democratic stability, it's related, sometimes correlated, and sometimes provoked and generated by the action of the Cuban regime in this hemisphere. From the collapse and maintenance of the Venezuelan dictatorship, to the guerrilla movement, to the drug trafficking, to the mass migration that we have lived the last 5 years, and all the wave that we lived before during the last 6 decades. So no, we do not need a Delcy Rodriguez. The way in which power is exerted in Cuba is very different. We do not have a pleiade of powerful actors in Cuban national territory as we have it in Venezuela, very different and with different masters. In the case of Cuba, it's pretty much a dozen of persons. It's pretty much a family and a bunch of generals and a few representatives that needs to leave power in order to have an orderly transition process. And while we shouldn't be thinking the way we have to, the path we have to walk away from is the one that, that is trying to appease or to manage those dozen of persons. We have to be very clear. We need them to leave, and now it's possible among several reasons, and not because of the failure of democracy, of diplomacy, in my humble opinion, but because of the recognition of the limits of diplomacy. We are not dealing with a normal state. We are dealing with criminals in power that are ready to kill you, as they did with my father when he tried to use the system against the system legally. You cannot use a weaponry that is not that is not the same one that they are using against you. We are dealing with a criminal group in power that is also a military group that also sits over the intelligence apparatus that, in my opinion, is the most influential intelligence apparatus in this hemisphere. As we speak, the largest, and beyond, I had to say, as we speak, the largest number of foreign nationals in the Russian army in the front in Ukraine is Cuban. As we speak, China maintains espionage bases in Cuban territory. We are worried about the mining in Venezuela. Well, I'm also worried about the mining in Nicaragua and the presence of China and the gatekeepers and the brokers of that interference in Western territory has been those that have been interfering for decades, and is the intelligence apparatus of the Cuban regime that, by the way, have one main goal, and is destabilizing this country through mass migration, through drug trafficking, through intelligence penetrations. The last 50 years, the largest intelligence penetrations in the highest level of the US government have been exerted by the Cuban regime. So President Trump and Secretary Rubio are right when they say that the Cuban regime is a threat to the national security of this country. And yes, China, Russia, Iran, all of them have been propping, and others have been propping up the Cuban regime, and they are still trying to help. But 80 million is not going to make the difference, which is what China, the check that China wrote. And one oil tanker is not going to make the difference. From when I'm sitting, they are virtually saying, not my problem. When we talk about the Cuban regime. And I know you have another question I want to say.
No, I want to just follow up, because you have mentioned so many challenges in a way for a transition process in Cuba. For example, the dismantling of that big security surveillance system, that's going to be a major challenge. So I want to ask you about that. You know, in the Venezuela regime transition, where do you see the major challenges in the immediate and medium term? And what do you see your role and the role of Cuban exiles in general? It's a really, two big questions. We have 4 minutes.
Okay. Transition in Cuba and the difference with the way it's being, I think, started in Venezuela, and I hope that María Corina Machado will be back soon, and they will have the rule of law and the democratic leaders that the Venezuelan people deserve, and we need to see a calendar for that to happen, because I agree the window is narrow. Now, in Cuba, there are a lot of challenges. Mm-hmm. I have to say, the biggest headache is liberation. The biggest headache is force those criminals in power to leave. And now, the leverage is there. Needs to be intensified, but it's there, so it is possible. The situation on the island is unsustainable, and I have to say more. For the Cuban people, for the Cuban nation, that, by the way, Nora, the Cuban nation lives on island and off island. In the last 5 years, millions of Cubans have emigrated, have been forced to exile. The same thing has happened during the last 60 decades, and the Cuban nation has a resource that almost not any country in the world can claim, and is the power, the unity, the organization, the success of the exile community that never disconnected from the Cuban people, and that is ready to participate and to help during the transition process. And that's why liberation is the biggest headache. The other one, right, transition process, of course, is not gonna be easy. It's not going to be the first time in the history of the planet that we see a transition from a totalitarian regime to a democratic one. We have seen that before. We have learned from that. And that's why the democratic alternative is, I have 1 more minute, is that...
Five more, you have 5 more.
Oh, wow.
I'm told.
Very generous, thank you. It's very relevant now. That's why what happened the 2nd of March this year, when a big majority, I believe the main forces, but it's open to all the democratic forces, but the main forces of the Cuban opposition came together behind the Freedom Accord, behind an alliance that announced a transition plan that take care of the institutional political change that needs to happen, of the dismantling of the totalitarian structures at a political level that needs to happen, but also takes care of the humanitarian crisis.
I wanted to ask about that because that's a major challenge. You know, Cuba's not the same like 10 years ago. If we were talking about this 10, 15 years ago, the country,
it's devastated.
It's in a terrible situation.
The country is devastated at virtually every level, from the infrastructure to the energy system, but also to the education system, to the healthcare system, and the main task, the first 6 months, is gonna be humanitarian. Of course, there is also a commission for economic recovery, in which especially the exiled community, and not only Cuban Americans, are gonna be and are being so far a big resource. But as Elisabeth mentioned, that process, that provisional period that needs to take place, because we cannot have free, fair, and multi-party elections in Cuba tomorrow. We need a transition process that needs to be led by Cubans, and it's gonna be a unity government in order to make the changes that are necessary in Cuba. Also have to take care of the transitional justice, also have to take care of the security apparatus, also needs to take care of the huge amount of humanitarian aid that are going to be necessary, and as the ambassador said, that needs to be a collective effort, not only of the Cuban people, but also of allies as the U.S. government and other governments in the world, and especially in the region. If something is still an opportunity in the Cuban case, is for the rest of the Western democracies to finally take sides with the Cuban people and join the U.S. in these efforts. And I'm going to be very clear also here, because we have been hearing about phases, and the phase number 1 in Cuba needs to be liberation. The number 1 steps in Cuba needs to be the release of the political prisoners and the guarantee of the fundamental rights. By the way, not cost effective. Costs zero money to open the doors of the political prisons in Cuba. Costs zero money, stop repressing. Actually, it's cheaper not to repress that, keep repression ongoing. That's how we measure that the transition process is.
Ambassador, you want to come in on the issue of the resources? Who's going to fund this titanic effort?
I'm going to say something a little more controversial. Y'all know who Bill Brownfield is? Yeah, he's one of my mentors, Ambassador Brownfield, funny guy, Texan. Y'all all know who he is. I know you do. He told me when I went out in July of 18, he said, the result of this is going to be insufficient to please everybody. And I think that if you look historically at transitions returning to democracy across the hemisphere, we're going to have to hold our collective noses at what this looks like. Right now I'm holding my nose because I see Diosdado Cabello at the table. I'm not holding my tongue, but I'm holding my nose. So I do think that the end result here is, in all of these cases, is probably not going to be the dreamed of perfect result where it all works immediately, but rather a process of national reconciliation where people who were fairly bad actors may not face the justice that they richly deserve. Hopefully those that did the worst crimes do. But as much in Cuba as in Venezuela, the theft of the national patrimony that's gone out the door, we may never get it all back. You may never get it all back.
And that's, unfortunately, we're running out of time. That's a very sovereign, good argument to end our discussion. We're in Miami, we can be discussing Cuba and Venezuela forever, but unfortunately we have to stop here. This has been like a very illuminated discussion that I hope policymakers in Washington have been watching. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for listening to us. This has been great.